Okay, next, we have Severin Borenstein. Where is, there you are. Hey. Thanks so much for coming. Sure. Okay. So, as everybody knows, and we heard some of just now, electricity, of course, is a huge issue for consumers, AI companies, utilities, politicians, and just about everybody with the growth in data centers. And apparently, right now, we're at about, what is it, 20% of the size of planned data center size, current hyperscalers. So it's going to become a bigger and bigger issue. So Severin Borenstein has spent 40 years on the economics of electricity markets, including market power rate design, the gap between what power costs to produce and what customers pay. He's faculty director of the Energy Institute at Berkeley Haas, and he sits on the board of governors of the California ISO. So he doesn't just study a grid, he helps run one. And so thank you very much for being here.
Sure.
Really appreciate it.
Thanks for inviting me.
So let's start. There are two ways a data center can raise anyone's bill. One is building things, and the other is moving the market price. So talk about that and lay it out for everybody.
Yeah, the discussion about what data centers are going to do to rates is obviously front and center and the source of a lot of concern across the country. Most of this has come out of PJM, the Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Maryland market, which is actually 11 states now. And that has been a concern about what the new demand is doing to electricity prices in the wholesale market. And that has been quite substantial in that market. The other piece of it, which there was a case last year that was settled that I think has gone a long way towards addressing, is paying for local infrastructure. So a new data center comes in, you need to put in a new substation, you need to put in a lot of new hardware as a utility. Utilities have done this for 100 years, and then they wait for buyers to pay for it. The concern is that they make these investments and then the buyers don't show up, or they don't show up for very long, possibly because they go bankrupt, and that's a very big concern with crypto, and possibly because they simply find a better deal, and that's a very big concern because when we see these queues for new demand, new data center interconnections, every ISO and every utility knows that a large share of those are not real, that they are requests being put in multiple areas with the data center company not really intending to build all of them. So there's a concern that this local infrastructure gets built. Traditionally, we've paid for this volumetrically by charging per kilowatt hour. And if the company doesn't show up, if the demand doesn't show up, you don't have the kilowatt hours. Historically, when a small company doesn't show up, the utility simply goes back to the regulator and says, here's how much demand we have, and we need to charge thus and such price in order to recover all our costs. If you have a data center that's requiring a huge capital investment not show up, that's going to be a noticeable increase in rates. So there was a case in Ohio. AEP Ohio is a utility with a peak load of 4 gigawatts, and they had a queue of interconnection requests from data centers of 30 gigawatts. So if all of that were real, this would be a 7x of the size of the company over the course of 10 years. Now, as we'll surely talk about, that's not even possible given hardware constraints. But there was a lot of concern that they were going to make big investments and the buyers weren't going to show up. And so they have now reached, I think, a reasonable settlement which walks away to a certain extent from the historical duty to serve that utilities have and says, you have to sign a long-term contract. If we're going to make these investments, you have to sign to be there for 12 years. Interestingly, Google was the first company to agree to this, which I at first was surprised by, and then realized if you have a big balance sheet, this isn't a problem. And it's not just not a problem, it's potentially a competitive advantage. It's a barrier for small companies when they want to come in if they have to front the money for huge capital investment. So those are the two pieces. One is the infrastructure investments and the concern it's not going to show up. The other is the wholesale markets and what it does to those wholesale markets when a lot of demand does show up, which we've seen in the mid-Atlantic already, and there's concern we will see in other parts of the country. And going back to something Shane said, part of this is just the rate of demand growth that is being envisioned is just unprecedented. It exceeds what we saw in the 50s with the rollout of air conditioning. It exceeds what we saw with the very aggressive growth estimates we saw in the late 60s as nuclear power was coming online. If this actually comes true, it would be really a phenomenal growth rate. And as Shane said, we don't know if it's going to come true.
But let's go back to that for a second, because what we keep hearing is that there's this huge, just incredible, unprecedented demand growth. But then you just mentioned this issue of what happened in Ohio, where what we think we're about to see is not nearly as big as what had been expected even just a few months before. So explain what happened and what that tells us about what we think about future demand growth.
Well, I mean, we're seeing this in many places where the estimates, if you base estimates purely on the queue of interconnection requests, you're going to get a gigantic number. And everyone, I think, understands that's not a real number. On the other hand, as we have, and this is unfolding over month by month, not year by year. I chaired a session at the meeting in June of all of the ISO boards, and when we were planning that session on large data centers, there's somebody from PJM, where they're in the midst of it, Southwest Power Pool, where they're starting to see this, and CAISO, California, where it hadn't really shown up yet. By the time the session occurred, everything had rocketed forward. PJM was in a crisis, SPP had huge demand, and CAISO is now starting to see it. Even California's high rates is not protecting it because if you're familiar with this area, the term speed to power dominates everything. That these data centers are willing to pay a lot of money in order to interconnect, and it turns out California right now has headroom to interconnect more quickly. So everyone is now seeing this. So we just don't know how long it's going to go on. And, the DeepSeek day from sometime last year, I can't remember, was it April, February, where the one day where DeepSeek announced we can do all of this with massively less compute, and the markets for all the data centers crashed and came back fairly quickly, shows that even the market knows it doesn't know. And there is a chance we're going to see much less growth in demand. This should be somewhat humbling. If you look back to the dot-com boom, some of my colleagues, Hal Varian, Jeff Mackey Mason, wrote a paper in the late 90s about how the internet was doubling every 6 months or something and doing forecasting of what would happen to electricity demand. And John Koomey and Eric Massonet have a paper, a book, that shows what actually happened. And what actually happened is data centers got massively more efficient, compute got massively more efficient. We're probably not going to see that massive an efficiency gain, but their numbers are just eye-popping. We got 20x increase in usage and less than a doubling of electricity usage.
When you say California has headroom, what do you mean by that?
So the North American Electricity Reliability Council every year puts out sort of how is each ISO, how's each grid doing, and how much space do they have? and where are the red flags where they might run short. And if you go back 5 years, if you're from California or remember, California had some rolling blackouts in 2020 and was in pretty bad shape. Since then, we've built out a lot more solar, but more importantly, we've built out a lot more batteries. And California now is coming in with the most amount of space at its peak demand of all of the grids. PJM is in real trouble. The MISO, the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator, is very tight. And so although those are places data centers would like to locate because of low prices, they are getting pushback because the ISOs are saying, we don't have capacity to handle you. And so they fulfill duty to serve by saying, we will interconnect you, and then they mumble in 2 or 3 years. And so we are seeing a gradual reapplication of the legal doctrine.
So we're going to talk about the pledge that hyperscalers are making, but I want to jump forward a little bit to flexibility, because you said that they want to go where the prices are lower, but they can't because they're capacity constrained. That doesn't make any sense to me. Why are the prices lower there?
The prices are lower but for historical reasons, that they burn a lot of coal, that they have not invested in renewables, that they don't pay for the negative externalities. Okay. In some cases, it's because they have a lot of historical hydro. And they have priced electricity not based on marginal cost, but based on average cost. So the Northwest has a lot of hydro. And they get it very cheaply because due to federal law, and they average it in. Now, the Northwest marginal cost of providing electricity is pretty much the same as California's marginal cost of providing electricity. It's all coming from the same sources. It's an integrated grid. But the Northwest is averaging in a huge amount of hydro and just basically makes that available to new customers. So we have seen data centers find that very attractive. AWS has made real investments in that. Likewise, in the Midwest, there are a lot of coal plants. We're not building new coal plants as of yet, and that's kept rates extremely low in the Midwest, and it's attractive. The problem is that these data centers at least want to be very inflexible. They want to run when they want to run. They do not run at 100%. The capacity factors are closer to 60%, although it's pretty opaque. But they don't want constraints. And so they historically have not really been willing to be flexible during those 60 to 100 hours a year when the system really has its back to the wall. Interestingly, we're starting to see a little more willingness to be flexible. I have numerous former students who work at these hyperscalers, mostly on the energy side, and they have told me that there is a bit of a cultural disconnect between the energy procurement side at the hyperscalers and the AI side. The energy procurement folks say, we can't get the power this time, 87, 60 hours a year, and the AI folks say, that's not our problem, we're changing the world, go out and do your job. And you can see why that would happen. And so now, although they weren't really willing to ratchet down because it would cost more, when they are told you just can't interconnect unless you're going to be willing to be flexible, there's now a much more serious discussion going on about flexibility and the ability to, which Google has been talking about for at least 5 years, move compute to other data centers when a grid is constrained.
Are there any measures of how much of compute is on a flexible basis? I'm not exactly sure what the metric would be, but
well, I will tell you, talking to some of the folks in the hyperscalers, whatever the measure is, it would be very, very tiny right now. There's almost no regional compute migration going on. Google talks about it. Google does a bit of it, and they would tell you, we will move your compute. 5 years ago, Google said, we will move your compute to the greenest electrons in the country or the world. Of course, if you can move it to the greenest electrons, you can also move it off of the grids that are constrained. And last year, Google said, yeah, we can do that too. People at other hyperscalers have told me, yeah, they talk about that, but no one is really doing much of it yet. The AI side hates that. They don't want to have to start writing code, which is what this comes down to. And if you've ever written code, you know that you have to be able to put stops in the code so that you can take a calculation and move the whole calculation to a different computer or pick it up later. And that's what they're starting to figure out how to do.
So let's come back to that in a minute because there's so much there. But let's go back to what people automatically think about, which is what consumers of all kinds are paying and whether data centers are affecting those rates or not, and then how the hyperscalers mostly have responded with this pledge to bring new generation, fund upgrades, and pay whether they use power or not. So talk about that and what you think about that works and doesn't work.
Yeah, so let's talk about retrospectively and then prospectively. Retrospectively, not a lot has happened yet to rates. The main place we've seen an impact is in the Mid-Atlantic, and that's because that's part of the PJM ISO, and the PJM ISO has a capacity market, although that shouldn't be the real focus. The fact is a lot of demand has come in there, mostly Virginia, as you've probably heard, and as Shane just showed, and that has massively pushed up the wholesale cost of electricity, both energy and capacity. And that has shown up as a significant increase. By the way, the significant increase, if you actually do the math, amounts to 2 to 3 cents a kilowatt hour, which in most of the Mid-Atlantic is a more than 10%, possibly 20% in parts of New Jersey, cost increase in the retail price. If you did that in California, our rates are so high that it's sort of in the noise. But in the Mid-Atlantic, it's had a big effect. This fear that we're going to build a bunch of capacity and then we're going to have to raise rates because the demand doesn't show up, has not actually occurred yet, but it is a recognition. And there have been some bankruptcies of crypto mining in Texas, but it's been at a scale that has not been a big issue. So that's retrospectively. Prospectively, there is a lot of concern in both of these areas, and that has led to the Ratepayer Protection Pledge, which came out of the White House, which is responding to the very negative and growing political movement about data centers. So this started out as a more left-wing issue, and it's now become much more bipartisan. Even Greg Abbott, the governor of Texas, has completely pivoted from, we want all the data centers come to Texas, to, whoa, we're putting a pause on all of this until we can make sure that it's not going to cause costs to go up for ratepayers. And what the Ratepayer Protection Plan from the White House says is pretty unrealistic, because it, on the one hand, wants, and President Trump has said, the U.S. has to be the center of AI and data centers. And so it's saying you have to accommodate all the data centers, you have to let them move in and give them what they want, but you also have to make sure that it's not going to cost anyone else anything. And you just can't do that. Even if you were willing to allocate costs, the fact is the growth of demand that we are seeing, not that we will, that is being forecast 5 years from now, but that we're already seeing, cannot be accommodated. There's not enough hardware. And so we don't have the capacity to actually accommodate what's almost certainly going to show up in the next 3 years. And so the fact is, you can't say, just make sure that they're not going to impose costs on other people. On the infrastructure side, you can say that to AI companies and say you have to pay for your infrastructure. That will slow them down a bit because there isn't enough infrastructure available right now. But on the wholesale energy side, you're just putting more demand into a wholesale market. And when you do that, it's going to drive up price. and sometimes it will drive it up quite substantially, and that creates a rent transfer. The buyers are made, the incumbent buyers are made worse off, and the sellers are made better off. And this is no different than has happened in the oil market and during the boom in the 2006-07 period, and during the supply crunch that we've seen since the beginning of the Iran war, that sellers make a lot of money and buyers are hurt by it. Historically, we have not said that anyone has to reimburse the buyers for being worse off, but the ratepayer protection pledge at least implies that. At least if you're really going to protect ratepayers, what we've seen in Northern Virginia and the Mid-Atlantic is that's going to be a big part of the cost. And there's just no way to accommodate all of that new demand and not have that price increase. If we really tried to say that data centers have to pay for all of the rent transfer, that would be an enormous cost that would surely undermine the growth of data centers.
But that's what they're sort of saying through the take or pay, right?
No, and so the take or pay is much more about the building the infrastructure.
Oh, okay.
The ratepayer, the rent transfer in the wholesale market is something that I think in some cases naivete, in some cases consciously turning a blind eye to. No one is willing to really address, because it's hard to, if you're going to have rapid demand growth, supply cannot keep up with it in the next 5 years, possibly the next 10 if we really see if we get a higher end outcome of demand growth. That is going to have very significant impacts on the wholesale market, and that means anyone buying in that wholesale market is going to be worse off, and the ratepayer protection pledge is at best vague on that, and I think if you read it carefully, probably is just ignoring that.
So, I mean, mostly we hear about issues on that area. We hear from residential consumers, but I assume industrial consumers
are
going to be hit even harder, maybe, right?
Industrial consumers are likely to be hit proportionally harder because they pay for less of the downstream infrastructure. It's important to understand, data centers tend to connect at the transmission level, and therefore they don't pay for the distribution grid. And the distribution grid is where we're seeing a lot of impacts of things like wildfire hardening and so forth. So they're not going to really help with that. Mm-hmm. When people say data centers could help drive down prices by spreading fixed costs, there's truth to that, but it can be overstated because traditionally, if you connect at the transmission level, you don't pay for any of the distribution grid, and that has a certain legal basis and a certain logical basis. But those other industrial customers who also connect at the transmission level, or who for other political reasons or cost allocation reasons simply are not paying for as much of the distribution grid, are going to be hit proportionally more by these higher wholesale electricity prices.
Talk about this, the take or pay idea, just because we don't have a good history with that. Why is it coming back?
Well, actually, we do have, if you think about parallels in other industries, this is not new. Right. If an automaker goes to a part supplier and says, we'd like you to be ready to produce this fender for us, and yeah, it's $1 million investment, and no, we're not willing to commit to buying any of it from you, the seller's going to say, we're not doing that. Show us the contract. When you show us the contract, we'll make the investment. That historically has not been how utilities work. Right. Utilities have had a duty to serve. They have done forecasts of demand, and they have just made the investment. And if the demand didn't show up, as it didn't in the 1970s, when we saw a big slowdown in electricity demand growth after we'd just been building out all these nuclear power plants, you just spread it over everyone. Well, what we're seeing now is incredibly rapid demand and forecast for even more rapid demand growth, that the only way you could meet that is by making huge investments right now. And the utilities are saying, wait, we can't stick with the old model. The old model doesn't work when we have a utility like AEP Ohio with a 4 gigawatt peak suddenly facing 30 gigawatts in new demand. And so they're saying we need to modify this commitment that we will be there ahead of demand so that customers can count on being able to buy whatever they want. And just a side note here, this goes back to something that two things that we really, I know that many people are familiar with the telecom models. First of all, in electricity, we still collect most costs volumetrically. So most costs, including a lot of fixed costs, are collected on a per kilowatt hour basis. We long ago stopped charging per minute of conversation or per bit of data because we realized that doesn't really match the cost that's being imposed on the system. There is, for mostly political economy reasons of winners and losers, huge pushback on making that change in the electricity market, and it's happening very, very gradually. So we aren't really seeing the change in the system that we have seen in other industries because it remains a regulated industry. And the other piece of this is that the system that we have of what's called a full requirements contract, where the seller announces a price and the buyer gets to buy whatever quantity they want for a year or two when they want it at that price. That's the historical system in electricity, and it's just not something that matches to any other industry, and it's not something that matches to reality very well.
Do you expect that to begin to change? I know it would be a slow process, but...
It's sort of beginning to change, but the real change that we will, I think, at some point get to, which is a much more real-time pricing system with a lot of hedging and subscription purchases and so forth, I think is a ways off. If you look at the history of cell phone pricing, you will remember that for a while we were paying per usage, then we were paying for a block, and you had to pay a lot more above that block. We never got a refund from going below that block. But in telecom, you also had this option of just not putting through the call. And occasionally, if you're on a crowded freeway where the traffic is stopped and everybody tries to make phone calls at the same time, that still happens. That just cannot happen in electricity. Now, the official line in every ISO is we build to a 1 in something years standard. 1 in 10 is the most common. But people in the industry make a joke about that and say, our standard is to build to 1 in never. Because the political consequences of rolling blackouts are so extreme that even when it happens, California's rolling blackouts in 2020 were the first blackouts in 20 years. Historically, if you look at this standard, California met it, but it was considered, and those blackouts lasted 2 hours and were rolling. Most people who even experienced had less than 30 minutes. It was a huge political firestorm. So the belief is you really have to build ahead. When you combine that with full requirements contracts, you're up against a real tension, and now we have data centers who, if you give them full requirements contracts, could potentially really blow up that system.
So I wanted to make sure we have time for questions, but one more thing to talk about. How does behind-the-meter power affect all of this?
Yeah, and I am not 100% sure because I have talked to so many people. The vast majority of people in the industry and in the electric side as well as the AI side say behind the meter is just not a thing. 100% behind. Cutting the cord is not a thing. The gens are, there isn't the capacity. You know, when an AI data center says, first of all, we're going off grid, and second of all, we need 5 nines reliability. Those two things just don't match up. The way you get 5 nines reliability is by being connected to a grid where you can diversify sources and demand. If you're going to do it on site, you're going to have to build a huge amount of capacity that is going to sit around idle most of the time. What is happening is that because of speed to power, the desire for speed to power, a lot of these data centers are building a lot of power, mostly cheap, inefficient, reciprocating gas engines. And they are building that behind the meter so they can get started. A data center, and I think Shane mentioned, does not get built to 1 gigawatt. It gets built to 10 megawatts, then 100 megawatts, then 200 megawatts, and it gradually rolls out over time. And so what they're doing is they are building capacity with the first tranche, but I have not heard of a case other than Grok and Musk where they really are claiming to envision being off-grid. It is going to play some role, depending on what environmental constraints there are. It could play a bigger role. It is really a pretty environmentally unattractive way to do this, but I think no one really envisions a bunch of data centers operating off-grid.
All right, let's take some questions. Larry.
Yeah. I'm struck by the fact that neither in what you've said nor what Shane said, the word, oh, I was a cheerleader in high school. Right. Can everybody hear me?
You don't need no microphone.
The word batteries
Oh, no.
hasn't come up at all. I didn't hear the word batteries. And just to take the last thing you were talking about, with a data center having its own generating but is sitting idle, why aren't they adding batteries to a smaller generator so during those otherwise idle times, they're just supplying electricity to the battery, which will then help out in the peak?
Yeah, so first of all, you did hear batteries. I mentioned that California has put in a lot of batteries that balance the solar, and that's been a real help. At a grid level, if you start doing that at a customer level, yes, you can build batteries that you can charge and discharge. That is still not going to give you the reliability you need for a data center. You're going to have a dark week in January, and the battery, and you just are not going to have the battery capacity. It would just be completely uneconomic. And that's why you want to be part of a large grid, because you want to be able to diversify sources. So batteries will play a role. You would not build battery backup to sit there most of the year and run occasionally. If you're going to do that, it is much cheaper to build gas and have cheap, inefficient gas engines. But batteries are playing an increasing role at a grid level, and they will play some role. And the one place they will play a pretty important role is in the fluctuations in demand at local levels. And we're starting to see that. But that is not going to back up a whole data center. You either back it up by using the grid as your battery, and potentially there are a lot of batteries somewhere else, and we are starting to see that in California. California, by the way, went from being the sort of in the worst shape in 2020 to being in the best shape of the grids today, because in 2020 we had 400 megawatts of batteries on the grid and something like 20,000 megawatts of solar, and now we have a bit more solar and 18,000 megawatts of batteries. So California has been the leader in this. So California now has batteries. If you have a solar-heavy system, the problem is the late afternoon. And in 2020, we got to the late afternoon, and the sun set, and due to some pretty bad planning, we didn't have enough power. Now we are storing a huge amount of power in the middle of the day for the late afternoon and early evening. That's going to happen in other places too. Solar panels have gotten so cheap that if you have land, it makes sense to install them, even if you're in the vast plains of the Midwest where they don't get as much sun, because the panels are just really cheap. And so we're going to start to see this other places. Where we're not going to see this nearly as quickly and possibly ever is places like Massachusetts, where they just don't have a lot of open land. And that really changes the cost calculation.
Jennifer, did you? Oh, good.
I wasn't a cheerleader, so.
Sorry.
Yeah, so I'm new to this space, so this may be a dumb question, but you've put all of your comments in the context of ISOs. Does everything you say, from the investment constraints, et cetera, apply to IOUs?
Yeah, so just to clarify, most IOUs are inside of ISOs, and so about 70% of the total demand in the US is now within an ISO. But the Southeast doesn't have ISOs, and most of the West is still, the California is sort of starting to set up some markets in the rest of the West. But there are parts that are just old-fashioned vertically integrated utilities that trade a little with other utilities, and that's still the model in the Southwest. They can cut independent deals, but fundamentally the problem's the same. Interestingly, we have seen, those places tend to correspond to loose environmental regulation or less strict environmental regulation. So we are seeing a lot of AI activities in those areas. They also tend to be more integrated with the regulator and state government, in the sense that they are more directly pressured for business development reasons. So if you look at Shane's map, you will see that there's been a lot of activity in areas where the ISOs aren't building, or aren't in existence. There's been a lot of building. That isn't the dominant factor. Northern Virginia is part of an ISO, and they've had the most, but it's made Tennessee attractive, for instance, and I suspect we will continue to see that.
Steve, quickly.
So the PJM 2 to 3 cents per kilowatt hour raise, why isn't that a price signal for independent power producers to quickly stand up solar and other capacity to sell into PJM? Are there some artificial constraints there?
Well, what's an artificial constraint? There are building constraints, there's space constraints, there's environmental constraints, there's permitting issues. Yeah, PJM's under tremendous pressure to build, and the FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, has been ordering PJM to contract, to sign long-term contracts to get new capacity built. That's probably not the real problem. The real problem is that this has happened so fast, and that the price of capacity has gone up. And part of it is, you know, anytime you see a demand surge in a market with limited capacity in a market, price goes up, and you see a big rent transfer. And it's the rent transfer that is getting all the attention, really. So we are seeing big price increases in PJM, mostly on the capacity side. And that is leading to table pounding at FERC. But table pounding doesn't get actual physical capacity built. And there are constraints on the hardware, on the permitting and space availability and so forth. It's going to take a while to catch up. In the meantime, a lot of those data centers are saying, this really isn't going to work here. Let's go look at the South. Let's go look at California now, which we thought we were sort of going to be protected from for a while. Other parts of the West, parts of, Oklahoma, Texas. One of the large, and Wall Street Journal had a good article on this, one of the big areas for building right now is West Texas in the Permian Basin, because they're not going off grid, but they are figuring out that there's a lot of natural gas that's sitting there, and even a really crappy, low efficiency natural gas generator can make sense when gas is practically free.
All right, that's a good place to leave it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Really interesting. Okay, so now the next panel of people who will actually work on this.